Hello, everybody. Welcome to the ConnectWise MSP Threat Briefing Series, the February 2024 edition. I'm Rafael Marty. I'm the General Manager for Cybersecurity here at ConnectWise, and I'm joined by my colleagues Bryson and Drew today. How you guys doing?
Doing great. Glad to be here.
Yep, same.
Glad to have you. Drew, what do you do at ConnectWise?
Yeah, so I run all the teams that have to do with our service delivery and everything else. So we have a whole set of cybersecurity products that serve our partners and their customers. And so my teams are the SOC, our research teams, our operational automation teams, things like that really help drive a lot of what we do around cybersecurity.
Awesome. That's going to be interesting to hear your perspective here. And then Bryson, what about you?
I work with the ConnectWise Cyber Research Unit. We're a security research and intelligence team here at ConnectWise. We gather information about all the threats that primarily the stuff our SOC sees on a day-to-day basis when monitoring the security activity that happens for all of our partners and their customers. Gather that intel, figure out how we can improve our own detections and capabilities inside ConnectWise, and as well as publish different reports and try to keep the community informed on what's happening in the threat landscape.
Awesome, and we'll hear quite a bit from you in a little bit here, diving into a little bit of the threat landscape. What you can expect from this live cast here is we do this every 2 months, where we are giving an update on the MSP threat landscape. And maybe unlike some of the other reports, our goal is really to look at what's happening in the bad corners of the internet and then translate it to how is this important and applicable to the MSP space. So for you as an MSP, what can you do? What is the actionable insights we glean from this? And not least, it's about also helping you have the conversation with your customers to help them understand what is happening out there and have maybe some proof like, look, you are probably in the crosshairs of some of these bad actors as well, and you got to make sure you're protected from that. We generally have a topic also that we attach to these live streams. So we talk about the threat landscape, and then we have some kind of a topic we're diving in. Today, it's going to be the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Update, the 2.0, and we're going to discuss what the impact is for the MSPs and what are some guidances that come out of that. With that, Bryson mentioned it. We have a unit called the CRU, the Cyber Research Unit here at ConnectWise. And that's a group of experts, security geeks, and ninjas that are looking at everything that's happening in the threat landscape, in the bad corners of the internet, in the dark web, and in all these forums and so on, and then distill the information and put that back into our different services and products. And I hand it over to you, Bryson, to give us a little bit of an update. What has happened over the last couple of months? What are we seeing in the bad corners, and what's relevant for our MSPs? Take it away.
Sure. Yeah, give me a second to get my screen shared here, and we'll go over some of the statistics and things over the past couple of months. So our team does a lot of different things, and one of the things that we do as we when the SOC deals with an alert, so they monitor the different the EDR and the SIM and the alerts that are triggered from those, and then escalate those to our customers and work with them to remediate them. For any significant events, they include the CRU, and we do a manual analysis as well to gather intel. We also have a lot of automation for just all the different alerts that trigger and the different intel we can gather from those. And when it comes to just like the basic intel that everybody gathers, we start with IOC, so that's indicators of compromise. These are just simple observations that we can gather when we're dealing with a particular security incident that tell us mostly the infrastructure that a threat actor might be using, as well as like specific files and that sort of thing. And there's this whole thing called the pyramid of pain to describe how useful these are and how they change. But yes, just to start with, we're just looking at the number of particular artifacts or the indicators that we've collected over the past couple of months. So we've got IP addresses, domain names, files, and URLs. And you can see the network artifacts, the IPs, and the files We get a lot of those. The files captured, in particular, just the EDR, whenever it is detecting something, there's usually a particular file associated with what's being detected, and so we get those hashes, and then in the more severe cases, we'll actually get the files and analyze them, run into our sandbox. And if it's something new and interesting, we'll actually do some manual analysis and reverse engineering, and all of that goes back into the detection pipeline, where if we're seeing new particular techniques or new behaviors, we'll build out new signatures for detections and all that. Just looking at the past couple of months, one thing to note, and we'll see this when we look at a slide later, looking at like ransomware activity, kind of all malware activity, you see go down at the end of the year. It seems like the bad guys have holidays too, and this is something that's been consistent most years. Holidays are usually a bit quieter. There are exceptions, like remember Log4j a few years ago happened over the Christmas holiday season. That got kind of busy, but most of the time the holiday seasons are usually a bit quieter. And December, January were a bit slower for us than other months. But yeah, there's not a lot to get from this. Just kind of reporting on, we are gathering intel. We've got a lot of data. Most of it is, again, files, particularly IP addresses. The domains and URLs, we don't get as many of those, just because of just the kind of the nature of things. And it's much easier to see an IP address, while the actual like URLs, for example, are often inside of encrypted traffic. So we may not actually capture those unless we actually get a file and reverse engineer it and dig out the config. So every piece of malware usually has predefined locations where it needs to connect to, and that's hidden somewhere in the file, usually in an encrypted config hidden inside the malware. So part of reversing process is pulling that out. Anyway, before I go too far on a tangent on how to reverse engineer stuff, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide and talk a little bit more about what we actually saw in some of this data. So just looking here, we're looking at some of the top malware that we saw in the past couple of quarters. So we got Q4, so at the end of last year, and then looking at Q1 so far. Now, I know I don't expect everybody to have an encyclopedic knowledge of every type of malware out there, know what every family is. So I tried to kind of color code this and describe what they are. So the names highlighted in red, like Solar Marker and Trove Stealer, are info stealers. So info stealers are things that are going to infect your system, and then they're going to look for things like credit card numbers and account numbers and passwords, that sort of thing. So they're specifically the tools that are going to be grabbing that info. And you can see that's really the number one type of malware, or specifically the number one malware we've seen over the past 2 quarters is Solar Marker. And we've written some stuff about that. If you go back and look at some of the reports we published on the ConnectWise blog, look at our monthly threat brief that we put on there. I believe we've written about Solar Marker at least once, if not more than that, because it is something we see all the time. But yeah, it's just a typical info stealer.
I think, Bryson, I think we discussed this a little bit in the last threat webinar, right? The info stealers and how they work. And I think what that shows us, they're just so effective, right, for the bad guys, because like they're not doing things just for fun. There's an objective in the end, and it seems to just be working, that these info stealers, they actually gather a lot of this information. And with some of the cookie stealing attacks and things like that, that's definitely something I think also as a takeaway for everybody listening, that you have something in place that helps you fend off these info stealers, right? And I think Drew, like how effective are the EDRs? If you have an EDR on the endpoint, is going to help with Solar Maker, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, so in a lot of cases it will, but it also depends on not so much the attack, but how they got in, right? So in a lot of these guys have, specific techniques they're using to get in and what those look like. So, right. So, any security starts with your controls and what you put in place. Now you need the tools, you need the EDRs, you need those pieces. They're critical, right? But, let's say that you have a company that's installed and they have EDR everywhere, and then there's 3 machines that don't. Guess what? They're going to find those 3 machines, and they're going to use those as their home base to do the attack. And at that point, yeah, the EDR gets put on the back foot on trying to figure out how to solve and stop lateral movement and other things that are happening inside the environment that you've already let them inside. So, it always starts with good hygiene. One of the things I was going to say, it was interesting here looking between Q4 and Q1, right? When we start looking at it, is solar marker was obviously a big piece of Q4, right? When you start looking at it, it's interesting looking at Q1 and we, at least up to this point, as you start seeing it, how it's kind of spreading out. We're seeing more rat type attacks. We're seeing other things, and you're seeing a move, more of a broad-based attack across multiple different techniques and things than maybe what we saw late in Q4 as we start seeing those pieces.
So it's like for Christmas, they knew what they wanted, right? And then in the new year, they're trying things, like new things again, and see what is going to stick. Like, interesting.
So yeah, the other types of malware here, a rat or is a remote access tool. So think of it like a malicious RMM. Essentially, gives them remote access to your computer, lets them run whatever they want on it. It's how a threat actor might have persistence and remotely run commands on your system. Net Support Manager is one we've been seeing a lot over the past couple of quarters, which actually was a legitimate remote access tool originally written for IT professionals. Was free, and then it got, I believe the company, it's not being made anymore. I'm not sure if the company who originally wrote it is still around or not, but it's been modified and is really just used for malicious purposes nowadays. But some of you who have been in the IT industry for a while may recognize Net Support Manager and not realize that nowadays, if you see it, it's probably being used maliciously. A loader is for a lot of different threat actors, the loader is going to be the initial thing that you get infected with. So that primarily its purpose is just to download something else. You will see for a lot of threat actors, while there are some that obviously who are writing their own malware, most of them out there are just gathering pieces of malware from other groups through a whole ecosystem on dark net sites and different hacking sort of websites and forums that are out there. So they're purchasing access to either code or to builders that create their own specific versions of these malwares, and they're usually putting these tools together. So they may start with a loader, then go to and have it install a rat, which then lets them get an info stealer or building to ransomware. But we often see them putting together their own different toolkits. But then if we look at like Black Energy, it's in and of itself basically a toolkit. So it's got all these different components and plugins that you can install. Excuse me. Just depending on what you purchase from the actual malware author, you get these different plugins that give you different abilities, such as abilities to download additional files or to run commands, or they have plugins for stealing passwords. So rather than having individual software or specific malware components, sometimes those get included into a sort of plugin type system. Data wipers are a lot of times they might show up as like fake ransomware, but they're essentially, the purpose is just to delete data. So this is going to be less often a financially motivated type attack. So not so much after stealing your data, but they're just out to actually destroy stuff. So it might be more commonly used by like hacktivists. We saw it a lot with international politics involved. When we were talking, when Ukraine and Russia conflict started, we saw a lot of these sort of disk wipers being deployed in Ukraine that were really just all geared at like shutting down critical infrastructure. So just infect the electric grid and delete all the data on all the systems that you can. That sort of thing. We saw a lot of those.
What operating system is Starlink running? Just for the data wipe? No.
I don't know. I really looked into Starlink. I assume they probably have some sort of embedded Linux running, but
it'll be hard, yeah.
Certain. And then coin miners. While it's not generally profitable to run to mine, say, Bitcoin on your computer, on your CPU, you usually have to have specialty hardware for it. XMRig mines Monero, and if you get enough systems mining it, you actually can generate some Monero just in CPU mining. So it's basically just they install malware that's just using up your CPU and mining crypto.
So this is every time that your fan starts spinning out of control and your laptop seems to be taking off like an airplane, it might be a crypto miner running.
It could be, yeah. So those are the different types of malware. And yeah, as Drew said, we have seen a bit more variety, at least in the top 10 in this past quarter. We saw a lot of loaders at the end of last year, and then this year's so far is a bit more variety, different types of rats, a bit more XMRig. We didn't see a lot of XMRig at the end of last year, but for some reason this past January and February, it's been popping up a bit more.
Yeah, it's always interesting to watch the movement of attack types around the price of virtual currencies. It's there is a very interesting on different attack methods and what they are. It's very, if you take like the last since 2018, right? If you back up and map some of the different types of attacks and what they are related to what happens in the price of crypto, it's very interesting to watch what moves up and down based on where they're getting their money. Are they getting their money off crypto? Are they getting their money off extortion? Are they getting their money off other places based on the groups? And it's, not so much that I can sit here and say, oh, it's definitively X, but it's very interesting when you watch it. They do have a correlation.
It makes a lot of sense, right? Like crypto, what is it at $40-something thousand right now for Bitcoin, right? Like if for the attacks, if they ask for one Bitcoin, that's 40,000 now. It was 25 not that long ago, right? So it's more efficient economically to just keep with Bitcoin and you don't have to go mine them. Yeah, cool. What else do you have, Bryce, in here?
So looking at just ransomware activity, a big thing we want to point out is just in all of 2023, we saw almost twice as much ransomware sightings than in 2022. So there was definitely a huge spike in 2023. And you can see there at the end, again, the holidays come around and things kind of dip down and quiet out a bit. Now, 2022 was kind of a weird year because we saw in the first part of the year, ransomware sort of dropped down a bit, and it took it a while for it to catch back up. And that's largely attributed to, again, when the Russian-Ukraine conflict kicked off, a lot of the threat actors who were big into ransomware were a lot of them are based in Russia, and their focus changed, and they were helping with the cyber conflict portion of that war. So there was kind of an interesting sort of dip that occurred, but things have definitely spun back up. And like I said, we saw, I think it was something like a 94% increase, I believe, when we just kind of finished putting together a draft of our annual threat report. And if I remember correctly, that was the total for the year, the increase we saw in 2023. So ransomware is definitely back up. Not particularly groundbreaking news, because that's kind of the news every year. Ransomware is always going up, it seems. But yeah, it was definitely a significant increase last year. Now, a big part of that were related to specific vulnerabilities. Like we talked a bit last year about the Move IT vulnerability, which was a like a managed file transfer system, and I believe it was CLOP compromised several hundred organizations just using that one particular vulnerability. So that was the spike that we see like in August. So there was some activity like that, like a specific vulnerability led to a bunch of different infections all at once. So that definitely happens. But yeah, mainly it's going up. As far as like which ransomware groups are active, Lockbit is pretty much always the number one active ransomware group. They're known for having a really good affiliate system, but they're also known for being really quick. They've got some very advanced program. They've got some really smart developers supporting them. And they have a very quick encryption method. And that's kind of their main claim to fame is how quickly they can encrypt your system, usually within minutes.
Hey, Bryson, if I look at this, we've been talking about ransomware for quite a bit, right? Lockbit, Black Cat, lots of people have heard about that. So if I'm thinking concretely about, say, my system here, right, my laptop, are there certain vulnerabilities that these groups generally exploit that, like Lockbit and Black Cat afterwards are being active, that we can make sure we protect ourselves from, to not fall victim to these guys? Do you know that? Sorry, we didn't rehearse this, so I'm just kind of throwing this over here.
Excuse me. I can look it up and see what they favor, but I don't have the data in front of me right now. And I don't know off the top of my head. So
so let me speak to that for 2 seconds there, Rafi, not to go to a specific vulnerability or things, but right, but it comes back to, my soapbox item, which is good hygiene on what we do, right? If you need to be patching, right? Majority of the time, other than 0 days, right? Which they happen, but the majority of all these attacks and what they are not 0-day attacks. They're people taking use of existing known vulnerabilities, right? A vulnerability is already known, right? 0 days unknown, right? So they're taking use of existing known vulnerabilities and then just doubling down on them. And I think if at the first level is when you talk about vulnerabilities, look at your systems, make sure all the patches are applied, keep them up to date, do the right things, right? And you remove a good chunk of the opportunity for you to be exposed. Now, are there other things? Yeah, always are, right? And you need to do that. But if you can make yourself not the low-hanging fruit, it's amazing what that does to protect you.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on in the interest of time here. I think we have a couple more things to go.
All right, so some other things we like to look at are the techniques that threat actors are using. So MITRE ATT&CK is just a framework that includes a taxonomy that can be used to describe what threat actors do. So it's broken up into tactics and techniques. Tactics are what they're trying to accomplish. For example, initial access is a tactic, or impact is a tactic, and then the technique is how they go about it. Like, for example, valid accounts, which is a technique that just means they already had access to the account, whether through an info stealer or whatever the case may be, and they didn't, for example, exploit a vulnerability, but they already had an account and just logged in. So just looking at the past couple of quarters at the end of last year plus first quarter of this year, what we can see that overall there's really not much change. I have color coded so you can see each particular technique as it progressed through the quarters, but there's very little change from quarter to quarter, mostly just some things kind of switching places. And we do see the on the very bottom, like system binary proxy execution dropped off the top 10 this quarter, but I think it just dropped to number 11. And then obfuscated files or information was number 11 before, now it's number 10. So it's really not much change going quarter from quarter. It's all the same tactics. And actually, if we want to kind of drill down a little bit further for this, the next slide kind of does that. Now, this is, I realize it's not great as far as being able to read it. So we'll look at better formats for displaying this in the future. But what this is broken down into individual tactics. So at the top left, we've got the top 3 initial access techniques we saw specifically just in this year. And then the second one is execution, and then persistence, and so on. So we'll kind of look at that a little bit more. But one of the things
on that note, Bryson, let me jump in for just a second, because you and I were talking about earlier when we were looking through which slides to include and what to talk about. The top left block on this is so powerful, right? You had another graph we were talking about, should we include it, should we not, right? Which was talking about, how do the bad guys get in? And the reason we didn't is it was all one color, because, across the preponderance of data, the biggest way they're getting in is valid account, stolen credentials, things like that, and what it is, and the importance of really being able to secure and protect, your credentials on how you get into things and what that looks like. I mean, I think that block really shows it still, right? The other ones are barely a statistic, right? On what's there. I mean, speak to that for just a second.
Yeah, definitely. And we've been saying this for years, but yeah, the valid accounts technique is the number one method that threat actors use. So it's not really the 0 days. Definitely the 0 days come out, and when they do, they have a major impact because every threat actor in the world will jump on them right away. Also, there's the risk that, of course, being a 0 day means that you've already been compromised. So there's some sort of vulnerability being exploited that we don't even know about, and that's of course a big scare. But when it does get announced, everybody in the world jumps on it. They often have this whole you can kind of predict what's going to happen. That everybody's going to start scanning. Then they're going to start deploying coin miners because that's the quickest way to make a buck from it. And then we'll start seeing the ransomware and some of those types of other types of malware activity or threat actor activity occurring. But yeah, the valid accounts is number one. And you can also see that particular technique is used in other tactics as well. So it's also used for privilege escalation, defense evasion. Defense evasion being how do we avoid being detected? And a great way to do that is to log in with an already existing admin account. If they've already got that admin's username and password, which maybe they stole it from a LinkedIn compromise. That's one that happened a few years ago. There was a big password list stolen from LinkedIn, and a lot of the people in there were reusing passwords. So take your LinkedIn password and username, which is probably already associated with your business, then try to log into your business account, and then find out you're already an admin and can then do malicious activity, but it looks like it's happening by an admin and you avoid detection. And yeah, this is showing the number one tactic for each particular technique, number one technique for each particular tactic. I don't think we want to spend a lot of time kind of going into this. Do you guys see anything here you want to highlight besides the predominant use of valid accounts?
No, I think that's key, right? And I think you mentioned a little bit, the takeaway here really is don't use the same passwords for different sites, right? That's number one. People think it's really hard, right? Oh, how do I generate these passwords for every site and whatever? And just use a password manager. There's a couple free ones out there, right? It's actually really convenient to use them, and it's so much more secure. So awesome.
A password manager, unique passwords on every site, and MFA everywhere, and that stops most attacks out there, a vast majority.
And then, of course, there's the advanced things like zero trust access and things like that, your own infrastructure. But I think, again, passwords are an easy way to solve this. Awesome. Hey, thank you, Bryson. Super insightful on what's going on out there. Want to shift gears a little bit. As we mentioned earlier, we want to talk a little bit about the NIST cybersecurity framework and the updates that just came out. Maybe just very briefly for those that are not familiar with NIST, I guess in general, right? They're a US standards body, but they put out a lot of incredible documents. If you haven't seen any of the NIST documents, please go and look at some of them. They're really, really good guidance. And as you might know, for the government, that is a lot of the requirements to them that they have to implement. But for everybody else, they're just fantastic frameworks that the industry has in general started adopting, right? Because they're just really good coverage. They talk about all the things that they're being developed, and even internationally more and more aligned as well. So it's not just a US thing, but you will see other countries adopting the same frameworks or building frameworks around the NIST cybersecurity framework as well. And so overall, the cybersecurity framework is a set of guidelines and best practices. And I think we can always use some of those, right? To better manage and reduce the cybersecurity risk. And I think that's really crucial, right? It's like the risk is different for every company. The bakery down the street has a different risk profile than the regional bank, right? And so you can take that into account with the framework, that you don't have to blow things out of proportion. I'm sure you have seen Sunil use cyber defense matrix at some point. If you haven't, please Google that, the cyber defense matrix. It uses the NIST 5 stages or categories, whatever you want to call them, and helps you map different protections you have and things like that. And that's a core piece of the cybersecurity framework. It starts with identify, then goes into detection, protection, respond, and recovery. And you need to have something across all these areas. And that's just how the framework is sort of laid out. And we'll talk about in a second what the addition to that is. I think, and then overall, the framework will reference other NIST standards. And one of them is the NIST 800-53 control objectives. Not sure that everybody's familiar with them. Drew, can you give us a quick, what's NIST 800-53?
Yeah, I think if you look at it, 853, and then a lot of people will hear 800-171, right? So as you start looking through different levels of how you're protecting and what does it look like, right? It's predominantly a government standard, right? How do government entities that work with or subcontractors, things like that work with government entities secure their environments and what they are? And I think that's one of the neat things about this cybersecurity framework, is really it kind of started 12 years ago or so, right? When the original, when 1.1 came out, right? 1.0 came out before that. And I think the whole goal was to take things like 853, 800-171, right, that brings specific controls down in what you do, and put that into more of a commercial context. What can you do? How should you, from a simplified standpoint, start building your protections? What does that look like? And I think if we look forward to today, and you can see on the screen kind of the timeline of how this new version has come about from when they started talking about it to we're getting close to ratification now. I think the final draft is basically out at this point. Everybody's expecting it here sometime in the next month or so, probably, for them to come back and ratify and say that, okay, it's done. But how many people know that the cybersecurity battle has changed in the last 12 years? So it was probably a good opportunity for them to come back and look at it. And I know, Rafi, you're going to talk about some of the changes, what they look like, but it really does help bring us forward, bring, honestly, NIST forward into alignment with like ISO 27001, which is a framework, right? It's used globally around a lot of the world. Things like CIS, which is another framework, technical framework, those kind of things that brings in. But it's about really bringing that conversation forward, bringing NIST up to that. And I think really, for what I've seen in the draft and what we've dug through, I think it's really going to help raise this to the next level. That's going to set the bar for others now to come forward and continue to drive forward.
Yeah, awesome. We've been combing through the updates a little bit, and it's actually quite interesting to take on the lens of an MSP and what is relevant for you with the different changes that are coming up. And we wanted to highlight some of them, discuss them a little bit. I think there's some really interesting things going on. Overall, in the 2.0 framework, if you look through it, you will see that it has gotten there's a little more guidance around risk management, auditing and reporting. It has some refined language and some more actionable sections, which is always nice, right? Like, rather than just kind of like some fluffy wording, it's like it makes it much more actionable on what to do. And one of the key components I found interesting is the continuous improvement and measurement of IT security. And you see this overall in the market as well. If you're looking in the enterprise security space, there's a new category that Gartner created. I think it's called CCM, Continuous Compliance Management. It's a whole category now of products. We used to have the GRC space, right? The government's risk and compliance. Now it's continuous compliance management. And that's something that is just so crucial, that you continuously monitor what is happening. And then you get a guide, a sort of a baseline. You can improve from there, right? Because you can't always fix everything, but if you can improve, that's something that you can probably drive towards. There's also a extension. The NIST cybersecurity framework was very much focused on IT systems, and they are now expanding that to IoT and OT systems, and also cyber physical systems, right? Super important, because we see so many attacks. There was just a recent one again. Bryson, do you remember there was this Chinese campaign going on against Soho routers or something like that, that was pretty significant. I forget what it was exactly.
I think that was Volt Typhoon.
I think you're right. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And so it shows that these systems are vulnerable as well, right? And by the way, the Swiss toothbrushes, I have to mention, I'm Swiss, so I got to talk about this. That was fake. That was not real. So if you write about the Swiss toothbrushes, if you haven't, Google it. It's kind of funny. Anyways, and Drew, you had a good point when we talked about OT earlier. I think in the MSP space, OT is something different than we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think it's really funny how different acronyms based on where they came from and what industry you're in can change. Like, we work with a lot of really large organizations that are in the office technology space, which is, you think about traditionally they do copiers, all those things, and they also have some very significant MSP functions and what they do and working with customers and everything else. Matter of fact, some of the largest in our space are based out of that industry. So when you say OT in certain circles, it's about office technology. But when we look at the larger kind of space around security or process management and everything else, right, it's more about operational technology and those kind of things. And what it means is what OT kind of means in that space. So, it was just something we wanted to mention, right? Yeah. Because everybody hears OT and they think two different things. And it's just making sure we're talking about the same thing here.
Yeah, here we're talking about centrifuges and big systems and valves. I don't know. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. So I think when you're looking at the 2.0 framework, there's one thing that's glaringly different, which is the expansion of the 5 categories of identify, detect, protect. There's a govern function that was added. It's kind of like, I guess, like you have the 5 areas, right? And sort of across everything it's really this govern. And I kind of talked about this as continuous monitoring and management. That's really what it's about. It's much more focused around measurement, right? And one of the things that is really important is around the measurement is also that you can communicate these things. And it's interesting thinking about the MSP space and how that's applicable. A lot of it is about understanding what are these security tools actually doing for you, right? And like I keep saying, take our MDR service, right, that Drew's team is delivering, where we take care of all these alerts coming off of the endpoint systems. We shut certain things down in cases. We can roll back. And the thing is, a lot of this just happens in the background, right? The systems are there fending off the bad guys. We never write. We never call you. It's not because we don't like you, but we're just doing the job. But then you come back, you're like, are we not friends anymore? You're not talking to me. What have you done for me, right? I was like, that's that's the wrong impression you have. We're actually doing a lot. And it's something that we're focusing quite a bit from a product perspective, making sure we have these QBR reports, value reports, executive reports, whatever you want to call them, that show you what have we done to fend off the bad guys, even though we're quiet, right?
So I think the governance thing, right? When we're talking about, I'm so excited, right, that this is where CSF has chosen to go. Because I mean, we do trainings for lots of different MSPs and other things all the time, right, around our cybersecurity fundamentals courses and things like that. And one of the things we've always said is, from a control standpoint, if you implement something to put in place a protection when you go, you're not done until you have a manner to audit it, report on it, and determine that it's continually returning the results you intended and that something hasn't shifted and it's stopped being effectual and those kind of things. And to me, this whole governance piece is something that's been missed. Too many people have looked at cybersecurity as being a one and done, whether you're talking about compliance or things like that. You went in and put in a protection. You said, yes, we're safe from X, but guess what? They never go back and look at it again. And that's totally around cybersecurity the wrong way, right? You've got to look at it and continue to measure the effectiveness of the things you put in place. And to me, this whole governance area is about putting that in place, monitoring and checking what's happening.
I haven't seen anyone as excited about governance as you. I like it. You're right. Like, it makes a lot of sense, right? The other, outside of governance, there's another topic that I found interesting that the CSF 2.0 is calling out, which is really around asset management. Gosh, I remember, and this is a little embarrassing, but at least 20 years ago, it's actually a little more, I was working at a SIM company, and one of the big components that we looked at was actually CMDBs and how they're inventorying assets, right? Because back then it was Mizzou Networks and a couple other like asset management tools. And it's been a topic since then. We still haven't solved the asset management component of things, right? Like inventorying all the devices, understanding their configuration, their patch levels, managing these things based on business context also, right? Let that sink in for a second, right? It's not just I have a device, but what's the business context of this thing and how do I have to manage it? And again, like we've been thinking about this for so long and try to do it, and it's still a big challenge. And I think we can actually solve it, right? And this is where your RMM is playing right in that space, right? Like you get an inventory, you can see what else is on the network, but making sure that you have a governance function built around that, right, is really, really, really crucial. And key capabilities like automated discovery on your network to understand what's really there, and then the ability to somehow classify your assets, your devices around criticality, business value, maybe data sensitivity as well, right? So that you know where your your crown jewels are, and then continuously updating that. I think that's just so important.
Well, and I think, Rafi, when you start talking about knowing criticality, knowing where the crown jewels are, that whole conversation, this just, it comes up continually in conversations we're in around AI today, right? When we start talking about artificial intelligence and, well, should I turn on that bot that allows me to do this and what is it? And I think one of the big conversations around security of those, one aspect's the tool itself, right? How secure is it? And that's always going to be a conversation that the vendors have to be aware of. But the other piece is, when you're looking at a company, right, if you have something crawling the data and going through it, right, it's going to respond based on the controls that are put in place to say, oh, that user has access to X. And guess what? If in the area the user has access to, you've got payroll files, it's probably going to come back and tell you the payroll of every employee that's there, right? So you've got it. There's also the governance side of managing. We talk about zero trust, and I'm throw buzzwords out right and left, right? When you throw in, that, it's about managing, who has access to it, knowing where your data is, how are you controlling access to it? All those things are something that no AI is going to solve for you. You have to make sure you have good controls in place so that when the AI and the different tools run over it, they learn from what you've put in place from a control standpoint. And that is so critical risk, right? When we start looking at a lot of these, because I've talked to people who have turned it on, they're like, oh no, this file came back, and they want to blame the tool. Well, no, usually it's about bad controls that you've put in place lower down first before you turn the tools on.
Yeah, right. No intelligence of bad data, right? Interesting, reading through the updates here as well. So it starts with asset management, right? But it actually expanded into software assets as well, which I find awesome, right? Like kind of to your point, you got to know what's on there. And interestingly enough, if you know the CIS framework as well, number one CIS guideline is asset inventory, and has been for a long time. Number two is software and application inventory, right? So they're aligning here very, very well. One thing that scares me a little bit is under asset management 3, and it's around organizational communication and data flow mapping. Oh my God, this could open a humongous can of worms. Like, what are the data flows? Like, if anyone has looked at net flows at some point in their lives, I'm sorry you had to. It's a mess. Like, what are systems talking to? I mean, try to understand a network today and the network traffic. It is almost impossible. So that I'm going to be very interested in hearing and seeing what that actually means, how people are going to implement that.
Yeah, but it's so important. And I think it's another area that, when we talk about the maturity of the growth between 1.1 and now 2, right? When we talk about supply chain management, which has become more and more and more important, you can't be managing your supply chain, especially with external parties, if you don't understand what's your connectivity look like? How are you putting that in? What data is flowing over that? All of that is so critical to doing that. So it's, I agree with you, Rafi. It's going to be really interesting to see as companies grow into this, what it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe to round this out a little bit, if you look at the govern component of the asset management piece, it's really what you want to do is, this is going to be pretty concrete guidance here, right? Like, you want to understand what percentage of assets are inventoried. That's a little bit of a challenge because how do you know what you not know, right? Like it's not that easy. Want to make sure they're classified and then managed, right? All these assets. And then question comes up, how do you manage IoT devices and things like that? But there are solutions for that, right? So make sure that you're creating reports that quantify these kinds of things. And then you track this stuff over time and hopefully make progress in there. All right. I think that was somewhat of the summary of the NIST update. Anything you want to add, Bryson or Drew? I think we covered it more or less.
No, I think from my standpoint, it really is. I think this is a good thing. I've heard a lot of comments back and forth on people like, oh no, more's coming, right? You know, those things, but it really does bring the CSF framework, some cases past some of the other frameworks that are out there and where it is on multiple different fronts. So I think it hopefully is going to get, again, it's going to raise the tide for everybody, continue to drive benefits and change as people understand it and walk through it. Look at the tiers, right? Because there's still a tier process and it's not about maturity. It's about how you flow through. That's part of the CSF framework. They've kept that model, so that should help. So I think there's a lot of really good pieces here. I'm excited as people learn it and figure out how to implement it. And for those of you that are already, say, fully implemented on CIS or fully implemented on 27001, again, there's mappings out there to help you have that conversation across all those frameworks and what they look like. So there's a lot of great tools to help with cross-framework comparison as you look at it.
I just want to add that, just going back to the last conversation about, you know, assets and both hardware and software. That's what threat actors tend to do when they first get into your systems as well, is they're checking to see what your assets are and what software is running. You know, if we look back at the techniques like automated collection and you know, disabling security services are right up there at the top. They're looking for the systems you have your EDR installed on, or you have log reporting. And if they see that, they're going to bypass that one and go to the one you don't have it on. So they're doing a sometimes a more thorough asset inventory than you are, and they're finding which systems are going to be the best targets based on that information. So you definitely want to do that before they do.
Great point. Yes, and awesome way to bring it back, I guess, to the beginning of this. I think with that, we're coming to the end here. I have a couple of areas where you can follow up, or you can get some more information. If you're in the MSP space and in security, there's one place that you got to be at, which is in June 3 to 5. You want to be in Orlando. We have our IT Nation Secure conference coming up. If you have never been, again, this is the place to be as an MSP that's interested in security. We have tons of talks from super technical to more high level. We have conversations about things like what we talked about today. There is a vendor exhibit hall that has dozens and dozens of security companies exhibiting solutions for MSPs. So I really encourage you, if you haven't looked at it. Also, I think the call for speakers is open. So if you're interested in speaking, you have an interesting topic, please submit it for a talk, and hope to see you there. Then, in addition, we are have a look at the monthly threat report blog. That's something that Bryson and team put together on a regular basis. The December is available right now. January will be published on February 21st. So that's in 6 days. And then make sure that you dial in again in a couple of months to be part of the April edition of the MSP Threat Briefing Series, where we will be sharing the insights from the annual threat report. So we're going to look back. Bryson already teased a couple of things about like what we heard about the ransomware for 2023, but we'll discuss the whole report in more depth and give you some more insights on what that means for you and for your SMB customers. With that, hey, Bryson, thank you so much for compiling all the data and being here. Drew, thanks for all the input and insights that you provided as well. Until next time, everybody, thanks for dialing in.